So, what will we be covering? So, we've called it an in-depth look at healthy eating and nutrition, but obviously we've only got about half an hour, 45 minutes or so. So, we will do the best we can in that period of time. But we're going to be looking at the impact of nutrition on health and society, the Eatwell Guide and its predicted impact, facts behind the headlines, healthy eating recommendations on saturated fat, sugar, salt, and fibre. And then I'll go on to talk about links to Food, A Fact of Life resources, and then some suggestions for further reading and sources of information. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Bridget now. I'm going to actually go through the slides for Bridget, but she'll spend the next sort of 20 minutes or so going through some of the nutrition aspects of the Eatwell Guide and healthy eating. So thank you, Bridget.
Brilliant. Thank you, Francis, and really nice to be here talking to everyone today. So as Francis said, we're looking quite deeply, as much as we can in the time, at nutrition, and I think this is a very well-informed group. So we won't be doing any of the basic stuff. We'll be looking at some of the key issues that we need to look at. I thought we'd start just by looking at some nutrition in the news, and this is just a snapshot of some of the headlines that we've had in the past week or so. I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you if I say that there's all manner of misinformation in the news. There's a lot of interest in food and nutrition and the food environment in the news, and particularly how it impacts on children. So you can see a selection of headlines here today. Of course, a lot about affordability and the challenges that we have in making healthy food accessible to everybody. You can see one on rising fast food shops. That's, of course, sort of linking to the food environment and how the environment around us actually makes it very difficult for a lot of people to eat healthily. And then some of the kind of controversies, vegan diets, blood sugar, lots of the things that you might see in the papers and, of course, on social media as well. So that's the sort of environment that we're all working in. And, of course, what we want to do and what you want to do too is to be talking about evidence-based nutrition, giving people the facts that are based on science. Next slide, please, Francis. So, of course, we have a real problem in this country with poor diets driving ill health. And a lot of that is happening through the impact of our diet causing obesity and then the impact that obesity has on our health. So you can see on the left that food is actually one of the key drivers of early death in the UK, even ahead of tobacco and alcohol, and the prevalence of obesity is high. So notable numbers of adults living with obesity. And actually, if you look at the figures of overweight and obesity combined, that's about 65% on average across men and women. So the majority of us in the UK are actually, of adults, are carrying a bit more weight than is good for our health. And we know that is licensed has very high cost for our NHS and our society. A lot of the conversation about obesity is quite stigmatizing. So it's around blaming people, suggesting people are just pull their socks off and pull their socks up and eat less and move more. Of course, it's not as simple as that. The large increase that we've seen in obesity over recent decades is not because people have just become more lazy or more greedy. It's about our environment that's driving that. Next slide, please, Francis. And poor diet is really driving inequalities in health. And so, across the board, we are not eating what we should be, but that is most pronounced in those on the lowest incomes. I won't go through this slide in detail, but essentially this is showing how key health issues such as cardiovascular disease, tooth decay, and hip fractures are strongly linked to inequality, so that people born in the most deprived areas are more likely to suffer from these than those who are living in the wealthiest areas. And you can see at the bottom that very striking statistic that someone born in a very wealthy area is likely to live nearly 10 years more than somebody born in a less wealthy area. So Westminster versus Blackpool, but we can see those the impact of those inequalities across the country. Next slide, please. So early eating habits are critical, and we know that if we can intervene early in life, actually before school, really, but so looking at early years and early life, early childhood, that we can really make a difference to children's habits and their health. And the diagrams here show the prevalence of obesity and overweight at reception in year six, and you can see that children starting school sort of around 10% living with obesity, and that moving up to over 20% by the time they get to year six. So you can see that as you go through that period at primary school, there's a really big increase, and there's that presents us with a real challenge in terms of supporting children's health and preventing that trajectory, because we know that children living with obesity are at higher risk of living with obesity as they get into adulthood. Next slide, please. And of course, it doesn't just impact on our body weight, but also oral health. And there's some very challenging statistics here about the state of our oral health. So you can see that 3 in 10 5-year-olds in England have tooth decay. And again, this is very strongly linked to deprivation. So those living in the most deprived areas have a 2.5 times higher risk than those in the least deprived. There is a little good news here that of course, tooth decay is strongly linked to your free sugars intake, and that we have seen some reduction in free sugars intake in recent years, particularly likely because of all the reformulation that's happened due to the soft drinks industry levy. You might have seen that talked about as a sugar tax. So that has really driven reduction in sugar in soft drinks, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Next slide, please. So it's not all about what we eat too much of, also about what we eat too little of. And there are some nutrients where we don't see deficiency disease in the way that you might see when diets are very, very restricted, but we do see inadequate intakes. And the table here shows the percentage of people or children who have intakes below the level which we call the lower reference nutrient intake, the LRNI, which is essentially a level below which it's very unlikely that you are getting enough. And our particular concern are girls aged 11 to 18 years. You can see that the boys are not doing too well, but girls in particular, you can see that nearly half of girls of this age are not getting enough iron. Significant numbers are not getting enough iodine. And there are also other nutrients of concern there too. Also, this is about food intake, but also the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, where we get this data, looks at status. So not just what we get from the food, but what's actually in the blood. And looking at vitamin D, a significant proportion of 11 to 18-year-olds, nearly 20%, had levels of vitamin D in the blood that we know are not optimal for health. This is also the case for folate. And it's also the case for iron as well, where we see those low intakes from the diet translating into iron deficiency anemia. Interestingly, there was a big conference, a big nutrition conference just a few weeks ago, which a lot of our team went to, and there was a lot of discussion about these nutrients of concern. So vitamin D in particular, around the source of vitamin D. Supplements are suggested for vitamin D for many of us in the population during the winter months when sunshine isn't strong enough for us to make it in our skin. And there are 2 different forms of vitamin D that you can use in a supplement. They're known as vitamin D2 and D3. And research has shown that vitamin D3 is actually more effective at raising our status. But a lot of the sources of vitamin D3 are from animal sources rather than plant sources. So there is a bit of an issue there around what is used for fortification. Ideally, it would be D3 in terms of having the greatest benefit for health. But there are some foods that are fortified with D2 because they want to be available to people who are vegan or only want to eat plant-based products. Folate is also a concern. So you may have seen the news at the end of last year that there are plans now, long in the making, to fortify flour with folic acid. And of course, folic acid is very important in preconception and early pregnancy for reducing the risk of neural tube defects. But it also has other benefits for health in terms of cardiovascular disease and preventing cognitive decline. And so having additional folate and folic acid in the diet is likely to be beneficial across the population. And we are seeing that policy of folic acid fortification in flour coming through in 2026, but it's taken a long time. It's probably more than 20 years now since it was originally recommended by the government committee that this should happen. So, as you can probably imagine, the wheels on these things, when it comes to policy, can often turn very slowly. Next slide, please. So at the other end of the scale, of course, we have a lot of interest in children, as you being educators, but we also have a lot of issues with the fact that we're an aging population. And you can see on the slide here, by 2046, almost 25%, 1 in 4 people will be over 65. And that is a big challenge for the health of the nation, because while we're living longer, we're not living longer healthily. And many people will spend 20 years or more in ill health towards the end of their life. And so anything that we can do to preserve people's health, to preserve their quality of life, is a great impact for individuals, but also for the health system in terms of the burden that places on the health system and looking after people who may have multiple health conditions later in life. And diet, of course, is not the only thing, but it can make a really big difference, following a healthy diet, particularly if it can be done throughout life, to reducing risk of key conditions later in life and preserving good health. Next slide, please. So what is the government doing about this? Of course, it's up to all of us to work together to reduce diet-related ill health. But the government plays a really key role in setting policy. Then there have been a number of policies which you probably come across that have aimed to tackle diet-related ill health, both that are in place now and are coming into force. So we've had the soft drinks industry levy since, I think, 2016. And that is essentially a tax on businesses making soft drinks, so that a tax is applied when the sugar in that drink is over a certain level. And that's really made a big difference to the amounts of sugar that we see in soft drinks across the UK. We've also got existing restrictions on foods classified as high in fat, salt and sugar. So you'll probably be aware that there's a specific way that is done in terms of calculating the sort of negative and positive nutrients that classifies a food as being either HFSS, high in fat, salt and sugar, or not. And those classified as HFSS are currently restricted in advertising on programs directed at children. There are also restrictions on promotions of those products, but further restrictions are coming in this October to restrict advertising before the watershed, and also online. You'll probably also be aware that another policy the government has in place around diet and health is for free school breakfast clubs for primary schools. And that is currently in progress at the moment. And we've done quite a lot of work around breakfast clubs and the importance of breakfast. And we know that breakfast can make a really good contribution to nutrient intakes, but also from the social side in supporting children, supporting attendance, supporting children, because of course children who are hungry are not going to be good at learning or concentrating. So we know that there's some really key benefits that can have. Next slide, please. So we're now going to talk about food-based dietary guidance. I'm just going to check in on the queries. So folate, there's a question about British white flour being fortified with folate since 2021. No, that's not the case yet. So it has been fortified for some years with a number of nutrients, but not folate, not folic acid. This is coming in from 2026, so from next year. Some products do fortify voluntarily, but it hasn't been mandatory up to now. So moving on then to food-based dietary guidelines. And those of you who have been around as long as I have will recognise all of these. So you can see that there's a consistency in terms of having a plate model and different proportions of the key food groups, but we've moved from the Balanced Good Health in the 1990s to the Eatwell plate to now the Eatwell guide. Just very briefly, you'll see that actually the proportion of the food groups is relatively consistent, but there was a big review of the Eatwell guide in before it was relaunched in 2016, where statistical modelling techniques were used to look at the current diet, to look at our dietary recommendations, and then to look at what changes were needed in the UK diet in order for us to meet those recommendations. And so there's a lot of complicated work behind this model, but what essentially is sitting behind that is this is the proportion of foods that we need to allow us to meet our current dietary recommendations. Next slide, please. So we have this guidance. We've had very similar guidance for many years, but essentially we're not meeting it. So we are eating less of the foods that we want to eat more of. So not enough fruit and vegetables, not enough whole grains, but more of the foods high in fat, salt, and sugar than we would like to see. And actually, when this modelling work was being done, one of the options when they were considering what technique to use to revise the then Eatwell plate was it was suggested, well, why don't we look at people who are meeting the dietary recommendations and look at their diets? But actually, there were so few of those people, it was less than 1% of the population who were following all of the dietary guidance, that it wasn't possible to follow that method because there just wasn't a big enough population to do that. Next slide, please. So thinking about fat, and of course, so we'll be looking at nutrients rather than food groups, because I think probably everyone on this webinar is already very familiar with the food groups. So of course you will find fat in different types of foods, and you will find fat in the food groups across the Eatwell guide. But of course we know that fat comes in different types which have different impacts on our health. Next slide, please. So broadly, we classify this as unsaturated and saturated fat. It's a bit of an oversimplification because all foods and oils and fats will contain a different proportion of these, but we would broadly reference the one that makes up the most. Next slide, please. So there's been lots of controversy over the years about saturated fat and health. Is it good? Is it bad? Is butter good or bad? But the weight of evidence really does show that diets that are high in saturated fat do increase your blood cholesterol, and that this can drive this process of that which you can see in the diagram here of atherosclerosis, where your arteries often we will say furred up by cholesterol. So replacing saturated with unsaturated fat reduces your total cholesterol and your what is called bad LDL cholesterol, and thus can help stop this process and reduce risk of cardiovascular disease. So this is what our current recommendations are based on, that we should swap foods with more saturated fats for those rich in unsaturated fats. Next slide, please. So we have current recommendations that saturated fatty acids should make up no more than 11% of our energy, our calories, but all age groups exceed this amount, not by much. We're all at about, across the population, about 12 or so percent. So we're over, not massively. We have seen saturated fat intakes come down quite a lot in recent decades. The key contributors to fat intake are shown on the right. And so we've still got a little bit of work to do to bring those intakes down to meet the recommendations. Next slide, please. Something that has been quite a bit of controversy about in recent years is coconut oil. It's been suggested it's a healthy fat, especially with a drive towards plant-based diets, but actually there's very little scientific evidence to support any health benefits. It's very high in saturated fat, and so the advice remains to reduce things like coconut oil and replace them with unsaturated fats. Next slide, please. I also thought just a very sort of recent thing with all the madness in the US with Robert F. Kennedy, who's been health minister there, and also lots and lots of people on social media talking about the evils of seed oils. So seed oils are from things like rapeseed oil. So typically if you get vegetable oil in the supermarket, it will be rapeseed oil, but of course also things like sunflower seed oil and so forth. While there's been lots of controversy, it isn't really backed up by the evidence. A lot of the studies that have compared the two have actually compared them in not very comparable ways. So they've looked at oils in themselves, things like olive oil, versus seed oils found in processed foods, which isn't really a very fair comparison. So while there is a lot of controversy around seed oils, actually the evidence supports including them in the diet, as they are rich sources of unsaturated fatty acids. And actually there's lots and lots of evidence of the health benefits of having a greater proportion of our oils coming from unsaturated sources like seed oils. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, oils are, while we will talk about oils as being saturated or unsaturated, they're always a mix of different saturated fatty acids. And you can see this here with something like coconut oil being extremely high in saturated fat. Also palm oil, which is high, not as high as coconut oil, but also one to avoid. And you can see the other plant-based oils like rapeseed, olive oil, corn oil, and so forth being much higher in mono and polyunsaturated fats. Next slide, please. So then on to carbohydrate, which of course includes things like sugar and also starchy foods. Next slide, please. So free sugars often causes confusion, even for us, in terms of identifying exactly what is classified as free and not free. So free sugars would include all added sugars, but also things like honey, syrups, and fruit juices, because in those cases the sugar is liberated from the structure of the food and so is considered as a free sugar. And for those that don't count, lactose in milk is not considered a free sugar, and the sugars found in the cellular structure and so in whole fruits and vegetables. Next slide, please. So higher free sugars intake are associated with tooth decay and also potentially overconsumption of energy. So we have a recommendation to reduce our free sugars intake, and actually all age groups are consuming more than the recommended amount of 5% of our total calories, especially 11 to 18-year-olds, both boys and girls. But we have, as I mentioned earlier on, seen a decrease in intakes, which we think is largely driven by all the reformulation that has happened because of the soft drinks industry levy. Next slide, please. On the other side of that is fiber, which is found in carbohydrate-rich foods. So we have a recommendation to eat 30 grams a day, but adults are currently on about 20 grams a day. And across different ages of children, no age group is meeting their fiber recommendations. And so across the board, we need to try and eat more. It's not just for our digestive health in the here and now, but also to reduce the risk of disease later on. So things that can contribute are whole grains in particular, fruit and vegetables, pulses, nuts and seeds. But again, with fruit and vegetables, we're not eating enough. So about a third of adults and only about 12% of 11 to 18-year-olds are meeting the 5-a-day recommendation. Next slide, please. So we've got a couple of resources on our website, on the nutrition.org website, around getting fibre in your diet. So the meal plan shown, it shows how to eat for a week in a way that will deliver under 5% free sugars and 30 grams of fibre. We've also got some resources on fibre. So we've got a fun way to fibre, which shows how much fibre you can add if you swap from lower fibre to higher fibre sources of food. Next slide, please. Let me just check on the chat. So a query on saturated for unsaturated fat. So on dairy, that's a really good question. There has been lots of interest in dairy because, of course, dairy foods can be high in saturated fat, but evidence suggests actually that they don't increase cholesterol in the way that might be expected from their fat content. However, we would still suggest that it's a good idea to choose lower fat alternatives because they will still provide all the nutrients that you would get from dairy, but with fewer calories and with overconsumption, obesity being a concern. It's still a good idea to go for fewer calories for the same nutrients where that is possible. And about milk sugar. Yeah, it's a good question. So the lactose in milk isn't considered free. It is still potentially, we would call it carriogenic. It still can potentially contribute to dental decay, but not to the same extent as the sugars that we would find in other foods. So I think it's not completely sort of neutral when it comes to dental decay, but of course there are others in milk that can be beneficial to teeth, such as calcium. And in eggs, yes, the yolk will contain saturated fat. So most of the fat in an egg is in the yolk. Eggs in themselves, um, an egg contains probably 60 calories or so, so it's not massively calorie dense, but eating a lot of egg yolk will contribute saturated fat to the diet. Right, I must move swiftly on. I know, Francis, that I'm using up my time. So plant-rich diets. This is obviously something that's been very topical and is talked about a lot, whether that is vegan diets, whether it's more of a flexitarian approach with lots of plants. But plant-based foods are obviously included in a number of different food groups. So next slide, please. So lots of interest, we've just had veganuary, lots of interest in vegetarian, vegan, flexitarian diets. There's probably quite a lot of confusion about what is plant-based or plant-rich. When we talk about this, we usually mean a diet that has lots of different plant foods, not necessarily excluding animal foods, although obviously some people will choose to do that, but that we're talking about a diet with a large proportion and a large variety of plants. Next slide, please. So there are, of course, some health benefits. So we know that high intakes of red and processed meat are not good for health, and we have recommendations to moderate those. There do seem to be some health benefits associated with people who follow vegetarian, vegan, or things like Mediterranean diets, which are largely plant-based. And of course, diets that emphasize lots of plant foods tend to be high in fruit and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, pulses, which will all provide plenty of fiber and important nutrients and not too much saturated fat and sugars. Next slide, please. But of course, just because something is plant-based or vegetarian or vegan doesn't necessarily always make it healthy. So especially now when there's such a growth in vegetarian and vegan options, you can get vegan ice cream, vegan pastries. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always healthy, and you still have to look out for labels around high fat, salt, and sugar. And also, of course, if you're very strict about a diet and you don't eat a wide variety of foods, that can bring some challenges in terms of nutrient intakes. And some of the nutrients of concern that I mentioned earlier, things like iron and iodine, are more difficult to get from a completely plant-based diet. And so we do need to be aware that a lot of our important nutrients are found in animal foods. And so if we're not consuming animal foods, or if we're reducing those, we need to make sure those are still provided. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, some important nutrients from plant-based sources. And so if we're reducing those, then we need to compensate for that. And in some cases, that may be about fortification. So for example, in plant-based milks like oat milks or soya milks, we do need to look out for fortification of calcium and ideally other nutrients as well. Or it might be around rebalancing the diet. So for example, to find different sources of iron that are plant-based rather than animal-based. Next slide, please. So ultimately what we're looking at is a healthy, varied and balanced diet. And this is always our message, doesn't hit any headlines, but this is what we're all trying to go for. So plenty of fruit and vegetables and whole grains. We talk about 5 a day. We really want at least 5 a day, more if possible. Reducing foods high in fat, salts and sugars. Swapping more foods with more saturated fat for those that are more unsaturated fat, and follow these basic healthy eating principles. And it doesn't have to be, we hear a lot about specific diets, Mediterranean diets, Nordic diets. It doesn't have to be a specific diet, but it's about the principles and proportions of a healthy diet. And I think that's me. Thank you, Francis, and thank you so much for listening.
That's fantastic, Bridget. Thank you. That's been really, really interesting and very topical as well. So that's great. Just wondering if there's any more questions in the chat box before you leave us.
So I think I have covered the questions that have been put in up to now. But if there are any more questions, I'm happy to take them now or to get back to people after the event, if that's easier.
Great, thank you. I've had a quick look as well, and I don't think there are any more. So, there's one actually about the dental facts. What year are they from?
Oh, I need to check that. So probably the best thing is if I share the sources with you, Francis, and then you can forward those on.
That's great. Yes, we will be providing the slides to everybody. So you will have all the data and all the links as well. So we'll be doing that in the next couple of days. Okay, well, thank you very much, Bridget. Really appreciate it. And what I'm going to do now is go on just to talk a little bit around the Food, a Fact of Life resources. So I do hope that you will stay with us and find out a little bit more about what sort of support we can provide around healthy eating and the Eatwell Guide. So thank you, Bridget. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Okay, so just a couple of things, sort of basic things to begin with. We do have some teacher information about the Eatwell Guide. Now, I know we're looking at sort of more in-depth level here and probably more experienced teachers maybe, but you might find this a useful thing just to have a bit of a recap, and it just talks in a little bit more detail around the food groups in the Eatwell Guide. So obviously we've got the pictorial representation on the Eatwell Guide itself, and then this just gives you a little bit more background, and it's something perhaps that you could share with your pupils as well. We have a lovely interactive game, which is for pupils of all ages, and it's called the Eatwell Challenge. And the pupils can then choose which food group to put particular foods in, and then they get a score at the end. So it's quite a nice thing to do at the end of the lesson. If you've got an interactive whiteboard, you can do it on there, or the pupils, if they've got tablets, they can do it themselves. So and they get a score out of 20. So that's quite a nice thing to see how they've done. So that's just a couple of basic resources. What I wanted to do was just show you something a little bit different, because we have got lots and lots of resources on the website. But one of the things that we've been doing quite a lot of recently is about thinking about making your pupils think harder. And this is about sort of active learning. And we've got a number of resources which link to healthy eating and nutrition. And this one here is a nutrient comparison activity. And with this, you get given a worksheet which has got a number of food labels on it. And the aim of this is for the pupils to weigh out the quantities of sugars and or fat provided by the food and the drink. And then they compare the front of pack label amounts to the reference intake. So that's the maximum amount that should be consumed each day, particularly if it's fat or sugar. And then they draw some conclusions from that. It's quite nice if you do this actually with products, so the pupils can actually hold the products, have a look at them, a bottle of cola, a can of beans, a bag of crisps, something like that. That sort of brings it to life just a little bit. So that's that one. Then we've also got some estimating and weighing, and this is quite a nice in-depth activity. There's different levels that you can do it with, but we tend to do it as sort of the basic level, looking at breakfast cereal. And what they have to do is they pour their usual amount of breakfast cereal into a bowl and then weigh it, and then they then also pour the recommended amount, which is often much less, into another bowl, and then they compare the two. And then they just think about what sort of impact the difference in having the different size portions would have on their nutritional intake. And for cereal, perhaps it might not be such an issue if they have double the amount. But if you're then thinking about other products like fizzy drinks or biscuits or crisps or something like that, and if they're eating more than they should do, then that will have a nutritional consequence for them. So there's quite a sort of an interesting sort of activity to do with them and thinking about portion sizes as well. Then we've got another one which is looking at the Eatwell Guide, and we've got lots of food cards on the website and some Eatwell guides, some blank Eatwell guides. And what we get the pupils to do is to sort the food cards into the correct Eatwell Guide food groups. And then following on from that, and that's actually quite interesting because you can start off with it being quite basic, and you've got fruit and vegetables and sort of the starchy carbohydrates. And then when you start thinking about composite foods, lasagna, pizza, that kind of thing, where do they go? Get them thinking about that. And then also you can use the food cards to plan a diet for a day for yourself or others, and you could give them a group of people to do that, or a teenager, pregnant woman, elderly person. And then through thinking about that, they can then decide whether the diet meet Public Health England rule of thumb for calories to consume at main meals. If not, how could it be improved? If the person was a vegetarian, a shift worker, or very active? And does the diet meet the guidelines other than energy? So 5 a day, enough fluids, that kind of thing. So that again is quite a nice one to get the pupils thinking about the Eatwell guide and the practicalities of it. This one's a fun one. This is a nutrient treasure hunt. And basically there's lots of cards that you put around the room, and then the pupils have to go and find the information to complete the chart based on the information that's around the rooms. So gets the pupils moving about, and then using their nutrition knowledge to fill in the gaps on the activity sheet. We've got lots of case studies that you could use with pupils around nutrition, and they really help to put the things into context and encourages pupils to think about themselves in the shoes of a real world issue or a problem. So actually thinking about themselves, if they were that person, what would they do? And it gets them to think about pupil engagement, critical analysis, and also reflection as well. So case studies, I think, are a really good thing to think about when you're getting pupils to think and work harder. So those are some of the sort of the different things that you can do, but we do actually have quite a lot of just other resources as well. As you know, I think we've probably got about 2,000 resources on the website. So we've got a whole area for healthy eating for both 11 to 14 and 14 to 16 years, with PowerPoint presentations, videos, worksheets, recipes, lots of different things. We also have Food Route. Some of you may know of these already, but these are different resources that were developed for when the Eatwell Guide was first introduced and have been updated since. And particularly for 11 to 14 years and 14 to 16 years, there are journals, and I've just put a couple of examples up there. And these are really nice to give them for a bit of an extended piece of work, maybe some extended homework, something you've got to do for a cover lesson. And again, it gets them thinking about themselves and also other people to do with diet and health and nutrition. And there are ones about active lifestyles, food safety, being a good consumer. So it's not just about diet and health. We're in Fibre February at the moment. You might have seen us posting on Twitter about that. There's lots and lots of resources available on the website about increasing fibre intake. And we particularly have a Fibre February activity pack, which has got some really nice activities in it, including a Fibre February board game, which is fun for the pupils to use. We've got quizzes for 11 to 14 years and 14 to 16 years. The best ones, I think, are the multiple choice ones, because those are interactive and they are self-marking, and then the pupils will get a certificate at the end of those. So I know a lot of people are going to be coming up to revision time shortly, so those quizzes might be quite useful. So there's online multiple choice ones, there's paper versions, Word versions, and there's also Kahoot versions too. We've got some challenge-based activities. These are some new activities that we developed a couple of years ago. And within these, they are the pupils are given a challenge. And this one that's on the screen at the moment is for 11 to 14 years. And the pupils are challenged to create a social media campaign to encourage teenagers of their age to make better healthy eating choices. So they're getting to do some work around healthy eating, but also with a focus of something that might interest them, like a social media campaign. And it's a pack that's provided, which has got lots of information at the beginning for pupils to help them understand the challenge. And then at the back end of the pack, the PowerPoint presentation, there's lots of further information for the teachers who are going to be running the challenge, and some links to different activities that you can do. And then there's also a certificate as well at the end. So we've got these challenge-based activities for 11 to 14 and 14 to 16, but we also do have them for primary level as well. And then we now have got some new sustainable healthy food resources. These have recently been uploaded to the website, and we have 11 to 14 years resources at the moment, and 14 to 16 will be coming shortly, and then for primary as well. And particularly for 11 to 14, we've got these pick and mix activities. And this one here is a sustainable healthy diets pick and mix. So lots of different activities that will sort of lead into individual learning styles for the pupils. So they or you can choose the different activities that would suit them the most and that is of most interest to them, and they can then do the activities. So there's creating a video. One of them is writing a rap. There's doing some cooking, and there's sort of thinking about culture and awareness and talking to family about sustainability and what people can do at home as well. So some nice different activities that could be done. So that's about our resources. There's lots more I can talk to you about, but I think that's probably plenty for the time being. But we also wanted to give you some further information about some other sources of information that you could go to. So NHS Eatwell Guide, that's obviously a really good place to go for evidence-based information. Food Standards Scotland has got information about healthy eating as well, as does Food Standards Agency in Northern Ireland. And then our own British Nutrition Foundation website, which is somewhere we would definitely recommend if you would like more in-depth, more detailed information about healthy eating, and particularly the different nutrients, the different food groups, and then the different people in the population as well. If you're looking at children or adults or teenagers, there's lots of information there for you. Do keep up to date with what we're doing. We have an education newsletter that goes out every month, and you can sign up for that on our homepage. Follow us on X as well, formerly Twitter. And then we do have an email address, which is for education. So rather than contacting myself or Claire or our new colleague Orla, you could just contact us on education@nutrition.org.uk, and we'll pick up the email. Before I move off this one, actually, just wanted to let you know that we've got some more training coming up on the 12th of March, where we're going to be looking at the adverse reactions to food and also managing allergens in the classroom. So quite a sort of comprehensive webinar, and we're going to be joined by Barbara Rathmill from the Food Teacher Centre, who's going to bring her expertise to the webinar as well. So that will be Bridget, myself and Barbara on the 12th of March. Snacktember, my colleague Claire wouldn't forgive me if I didn't mention this. We've had a bit of a change about this year. So Healthy Eating Week has now turned into a month. So we're now going to be doing Snacktember in September. And the aim of it is to help children and young people choose healthier, more sustainable snacks. And the audience is going to be pupils aged 5 to 16 years. But we are particularly going to be targeting those pupils who in the first 2 years of secondary school, because we feel that those are the pupils that have got a little bit more autonomy, they've got a little bit of money in their pocket, they can make some more choices, and they're the ones that we really need to get the message across about healthy snacking. So we will be providing resources, activity ideas, recipes, posters, all the usual things that you'd expect for Healthy Eating Week, but we're going to be doing it for the month of September, so Snacktember. So do register now, and then we'll be able to keep you informed of everything that we're going to be doing, and sending you the resources when they're ready.